Welcome back. You're watching The Market on eScreen now. Well, here's a very interesting note from Cushman Wakefield. They've released their 2021 Global Manufacturing Risk Index, and guess what? India has emerged as the second most attractive manufacturing hub globally after China. Not just that, India has also left the US behind in its global manufacturing ranking. Land, labor laws, of course, are going to be the critical components. Let's welcome on the show now to take forward this conversation Anshul Jain, Managing Director for India Southeast Asia with Cushman Wakefield, and also Manish Bhatnagar, the MD of SKF India. Gentlemen, good morning. Thanks so much for taking our time. Anshul, let's start off with you first. What do you think are the factors that have helped India's climb on this index? And you know, how do you think the equation in terms of manufacturing has changed for China, for India as well, especially in the last year and a half, as we've seen rapid changes in China's own policy?
Yeah, India's had a good run in the last, or I'd say a relatively good run in the last 2 or 3 years. I think there's been pretty strong push by the central government around Make in India, which have been making things easier. I think in the last couple of years, India's steadily progressed rankings and now number 2 in our index. Vis-a-vis China, I think there's kind of 2 different ball games here. So China, of course, is a fairly mature manufacturing market, and what they have done is they've moved up on the supply, up on the curve. So a lot more sort of AI, robotics, automation orientation, and higher end manufacturing that's happening in China. So that's kind of number 1. But number 2 also, which is very important, is given the trade tensions with China and the logistics logjam which has happened in the year post-COVID around the world, diversification of geography has been a big theme over the last sort of couple of years, for both those reasons. And Southeast Asia and India has certainly benefited. And the third reason why India has benefited is the big call on Atmanirbhar Bharat. I think the MSMEs have really picked up on, in particular, essential commodities, manufacturing with essential commodities. So I think it's a combination of a number of factors, and of course, the cost competitiveness, the improving condition, the reducing risks in India, which I think by no means let's say that all of that's completely sorted, but we are definitely in the right direction.
All right. Hi, Mr. Bhatnagar. How have you seen, I'm just going to ask you a bit more of a broader context question, before talking a bit more on your sector. How have you seen, manufacturing and the conduciveness of manufacturing in India change in the last couple of years? And do you think that, the world now prefers made in India over made in China?
Yeah, I would not go that far to say this, that the world prefers made in India to made in China. You're really talking of China that has set an excellent and a very efficient supply chain in place over decades. I think it would be naive to think that we can replace that decades, 30, 40 years of supply chain excellence in a couple of years of COVID disruptions. I would not go so far as to say that, but I agree with Anshul. India has become more conducive to manufacturing than where we were compared to ourselves a couple of years ago.
Okay. Manish, so just in continuation with what you're seeing right now, how much growth do you actually see in B2B e-commerce business happening in, say, the next 5 years? And what role do you think you yourself and other Indian companies can play here?
B2B e-commerce is an interesting story, which I think is on the cusp of taking off. There's been so much money that has flowed into B2C that sometimes we forget that B2B is where the real money is. So we are now seeing, the private equity players, we see money flowing into B2B e-commerce, which we had not seen 2 years ago. B2C has been flush with money, and we know all the names there. B2B is picking up now. SKF, we began our B2B site in January this year, and we are just amazed. Every week I look at the numbers, and I'm amazed at the traction we are getting on that website. Now you expand our experience with the thousands of such B2B enterprises in the country, and this is an explosion waiting to happen. So what we saw with B2C over the last 5 to 10 years, you will see happening in B2B over the next 5 to 10 years.
Sure. Okay, got it. Also then, Anshul, if I could get you in here, just the point that Manish was just making, where do you think is the big expansion going to come in? And is it perhaps going to be in B2B as a segment, and especially in the e-commerce category, according to you?
So, I think as obviously the e-commerce section has kind of really exploded in the last few years, or a couple of years rather. And as Manish says, if B2B is just around the corner, I think two things will definitely happen and are already happening. So one is the logistics and industrial sector, which is logistics and warehousing sector, which is about kind of obviously storage, transportation, and we've seen massive movements in that so far driven by B2C. But if there's a B2B expansion, then what all that means is that you got sort of obviously the manufacturing sector supporting it. We've already seen positive forays from the government. You've got the UP government really making a lot of positive noises. Noida has become a hub for sort of a lot of Korean and Japanese companies. It's been a hub for companies like Oppo and Vivo. And this was even sort of pre-pandemic. And then, of course, the Pune area and the Chennai area have been sort of, expanding quite rapidly from their sort of manufacturing. And that's kind of pretty sort of, diversified. Gujarat remains a big hub for, chemicals and different other because the government's pretty proactive there in kind of providing the land, which is a major issue. So in a nutshell, I think that we are at a cusp of a massive growth. We've seen almost $1 billion poured in just through this sort of pandemic. So in the pandemic year, we've seen $1 billion invested by various kind of large private equity firms in this sector, trying to develop and trying to get hold of assets. So there's a private sector intervention in terms of money. There's a government intervention in terms of providing land and capital to sort of MSMEs. There's a policy intervention. The market's kind of changing from B2C, which has already exploded, B2B that's going to explode. Plenty of opportunities coming by.
Anshul, I think the key factors around, or we could say the key niggling points on why India could not achieve this ranking earlier was land labor reforms. I think this is something that we've heard a lot of, participants, stakeholders talk about for India as being a key challenge. Now, we have seen some movement come by on those fronts, but what more needs to be done? Where are we on that front in order to make this mark not just sustainable, but to improve it as well?
No, absolutely. And as Manish said, let's not live in a mirage that because we are number 2, suddenly we can be close to China. China has got 2 decades of all of what you just said, how they kind of developed it, and transportation links, the policies, and of course the entire kind of supply chain. I think India has done pretty well over the last sort of 5-7 years, just building the transportation links. The ease of doing business index has improved significantly in the last 7-8 years from wherever we were 140 plus to perhaps now in 60s. So all those things have certainly helped. I think some governments have been more proactive in cutting through land issues, either for private acquisition or just providing land which is kind of free of encumbrance and for a particular use directly to manufacturing industries, which has been great news for people. The more industrial parks that have been developed, which is, let's say, private sector initiative, but it's part of an industrial park over the, in some states, which have actually done well. I think, clearly, with a little bit of land reform in some countries, with government, in some states, with government participation, a little bit of ease up on the labor side, we've seen significant movement. So one can imagine if these go further in terms of just creating a conducive environment for manufacturing to operate. I think we could get much closer to China. We could become the alternative hub, like we are. Like we're known for service sector, we could be actually known as an alternative hub for manufacturing. And I don't think we've got to look far. All we got to look at how how and the components of what China did to tackle each one of those problems. And those problems were there with China over years. And that's and we just got to solve for that. And in India, some progressive state governments are doing it, and we've seen movement towards those, and some others are not. And I just think if we have that concerted effort, just replicate some of the policy measures that China and other countries in the world have done to attract manufacturing, I think we'll be really roaring away.
Okay. So, Mr. Bhatnagar, we get the point that, yes, while India may be number two, that gap between number one and number two itself is very large, and it's not something that can be sort of filled in just the last 2-3 years. It's decades that China has invested in its supply chains, etc. You get around 9% of your revenue from the export markets. You also import a significant chunk of your industrial bearings. So, have you seen at least increased inquiries coming in for, your products from foreign markets? And what potential do you see for this export contribution to increase from the current 9%?
I think there's a lot of potential for exports from India, and we sometimes tend to think of India as one country, but India really is 30 countries in one. And Anshul made a point about progressive state governments, and there are some state governments that are very progressive and some sadly not. So we are seeing a lot of inquiries for exports from India, and we are right now speaking to a number of state governments to see where we can set up new manufacturing sites. And that's the context of my comment just now about some state governments are better than the others. I met a chief minister of a state about 3 months ago, and we had to wait 5 weeks before a response from their office. And the other state governments where we go and meet the chief minister, and while we are in that meeting, files start moving. So it's a very different way of looking at investments and looking at manufacturing. That's the one thing that certainly needs to change throughout the country. We need to behave as one country and not as 30 countries in one, because what really happens is that investment will then flow to those 5 or 6 progressive states, which is frankly not great for overall development of the country. The other one thing that we need to be careful about and be cognizant about is infrastructure costs within the country. We have our logistics spends of GDP is 14 to 15%, which is about double what any other comparable country in the world would spend. It's about 7 to 8%. And why is that? Because 70% of our freight movement is by road. We don't use trains well. We don't use our ports well. So that's the kind of stuff that needs to change for us to really be able to start manufacturing more and more in India. And the last comment I'll make is on the MSME segment. That segment deserves a much better look than what we've done so far, whether it be in terms of working capital for the MSME segments, whether it be in terms of management talent to run those companies. Because they need a lot of hand-holding. What China has done really well apart from infrastructure and policies and land and labor, is the development of a very, very vibrant MSME structure. And I don't think we've done that good a job here. And I frankly don't know if the government is looking at that as seriously as it should be. Hopefully they are, and I'm hoping to see more of that.
All right, Manish, as well as Anshul, thank you so much for joining us and for taking us through that conversation. Certainly a lot of work to be done, but the potential definitely exists. Let's hope that we reach that potential very quickly.